A court hearing was held in Montgomery County, Ohio, where 32-year-old Al-Mutahan McLean pleaded guilty in a case involving the tragic death of his 10-year-old son, Takoda Collins. The tragic events occurred in December 2019, when the boy's body was discovered after an investigation initiated in response to complaints from neighbors and social services. These alerts concerned the boy's condition and the conditions of his family, which led to further action by law enforcement. McLean was charged with child endangerment, which generated widespread public attention due to the prolonged nature of what was happening. The family had been alerted to the dysfunction for several years, but the tragedy was only partially avoided because interventions were insufficient. The investigation revealed that the situation in the McLean home had deteriorated each year, which ultimately led to the tragic consequences. At the trial, the prosecutor emphasized that McLean's guilty plea confirms the seriousness of what happened and the depth of the consequences of his actions. This confession caused a strong reaction both among the participants in the trial and in society at large. Numerous warnings and complaints earlier were not sufficient to prevent the tragedy, leading to a wave of discussion about systemic failings in social services. This case has become an important occasion to start discussions on how to improve child protection mechanisms in order to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The public and experts are calling for a review of existing procedures and more active cooperation between social services and law enforcement agencies to prevent the recurrence of such incidents. McLean's guilty plea thus brought attention to systemic problems in child protection, and the case became a starting point for possible reforms. Al-Mutahan McLean, a 32-year-old man, found himself at the center of one of the most horrific child abuse cases in Montgomery County. Before the public learned of his abusive actions, he was little known outside of his neighborhood. McLean was born and raised in Ohio, and according to those who knew him in his youth, he never attracted much attention. Despite his seeming ordinariness, there were events in his life that could indicate incipient aggression and violent tendencies. People who knew McLean described him as a man with a difficult and unpredictable character. He was prone to outbursts of anger and exhibited harshness in his relationships with loved ones. Several former colleagues noted that he often complained about life and expressed dissatisfaction with various aspects of society, especially those related to education and discipline. This dissatisfaction eventually translated into abusive ways of treating his son. Al-Mutahan McLean was a single father, raising his son, Takoda Collins, after his mother, for unknown reasons, ceased to be involved in the child's life. At one point, McLean decided to raise Takoda on his own, but the process soon turned into a system of brutal punishment and constant control over the boy's life. One of McLean's traits, the desire for total control, became a key element in his relationship with his son, which ultimately led to tragedy. McLean led a withdrawn lifestyle, and few people knew about his relationship with his son. He rarely interacted with neighbors and hardly ever left the confines of his home, giving the impression of a man who did not seek to be a part of the local community. Takoda Collins was the son of Al-Mutahan McLean, and his life was full of challenges. The boy, who was only 10 years old at the time of the tragedy, grew up in what can only be described as extremely difficult circumstances. Born in 2009, Takoda spent most of his life under the strict control of his father, who used excessive parenting methods on him. Takoda Collins was a quiet and withdrawn child, which is not surprising given the challenging environment in which he grew up. Unlike his peers, Takoda rarely socialized with other children, hardly ever went outside, and rarely showed up at school. Teachers who knew the boy described him as anxious and depressed, noting that he often came to class wearing inappropriate clothing and looking tired. Over time, Takoda became increasingly withdrawn and avoided socializing, a result of the constant stress he was under at home. The boy had a difficult time and was under constant pressure, facing extremely strict parenting methods. He was often isolated and forced to do tasks that were difficult for him to complete. He also had food restrictions and other difficulties, adding even more challenges to his daily life. Unfortunately, Takoda was unable to find support outside of his home as he was under the constant supervision of his father. At first glance, Al-Mutahan McLean and his son Takoda Collins might seem like an ordinary family living in a quiet suburb of Montgomery County, Ohio. Behind the closed doors of their home, however, the situation was much more complicated and caused concern among neighbors. McLean became the boy's sole caretaker after his mother stopped participating in her son's upbringing. Outwardly, the family may have seemed quite normal, but troubling signs began to appear, attracting the attention of others. Neighbors have repeatedly noticed the strange behavior of McLean. According to them, the father often showed excessive strictness, was irritable, and his son, Takoda, looked depressed, tired, and withdrawn. These changes became more and more apparent as time went on. The boy was thin, his clothes were out of season, and his gaze reflected obvious anxiety. People around him noted that the child rarely went outdoors and hardly socialized with other children. No one knew exactly what was going on outside the walls of their home, but rumors and suspicions were growing. Social services came to the McLean home several times on complaints about possible problems with the child. Each time, however, the father found ways to convince the service workers that everything going on in the family was either the result of misunderstandings or challenging circumstances. McLean was eloquent, able to convince others that his son's problems arose because of difficulties at school or the wrong attitude of others. He tried to present himself as a caring parent, trying to solve his child's educational problems, and this allowed him to avoid serious consequences. However, for Takoda, the situation at home was much more complex and difficult. The boy lived in a state of constant stress and pressure. His father's strict parenting methods were having a devastating effect on him. Over time, Takoda became increasingly withdrawn, stopped communicating with his classmates, and almost never left the house. His life was reduced to avoiding conflicts and strict treatment from his father, which greatly affected his emotional state. A few months before the tragic events of December 2019, neighbors heard increasingly frequent screams from McLean's home. These sounds grew louder, and some neighbors even heard Takoda begging his father to stop punishing him. Despite the growing concern, however, no one took decisive action. One of the neighbors, who later testified in court, admitted that she felt uneasy, but was afraid to interfere in family affairs. This sentiment was likely shared by many neighbors who feared possible repercussions and McLean's aggressive behavior. Eventually, Takoda found himself in a situation from which he could not get out of on his own. Social services, who visited their home on multiple occasions, were unable to identify the threat in time to prevent a tragedy. Despite numerous alerts and complaints, the boy remained in his father's care and the child protection system did not work properly. The relationship between McLean and his son was extremely difficult, and the boy lived in constant tension. The strict methods of control and pressure meant that every day was a real challenge for Takoda. This case underscores the importance of responding in a timely manner to signals of problems in families and the need to improve the child protection system to prevent similar tragedies from happening again in the future. December 2019 was a tragic culmination of the complex and difficult circumstances Takoda Collins found himself in during his short life. The home where he lived with his father, Al-Mutahan McLean, was not a place of joy and comfort, but of fear and pain. The events of this month unfolded rapidly and unfortunately ended in a tragedy that could not be prevented. According to information gathered by the investigation, disturbing events began to unfold in early December, when the father again used excessively harsh methods of upbringing. Obviously, these actions crossed all permissible boundaries. Takoda began to be isolated from the outside world, forcing him to spend a lot of time in confined spaces, such as the bathroom or attic, which lacked basic amenities. These conditions only exacerbated his condition. According to court documents, McLean's methods of discipline included such extremes as long periods under cold water and other grueling practices. The boy was not getting enough nutrition and was very malnourished. All of this caused Takoda's physical and emotional condition to deteriorate dramatically. The tragic day when the boy stopped breathing was the final blow to his weakened body. According to the case file, on December 13, 2019, an incident occurred in which excessive violence was used. The event proved to be fatal. When the boy lost consciousness, McLean did not immediately call an ambulance. Instead, he tried to cover up what had happened and did not call emergency services until hours later. By the time paramedics arrived on the scene, it was too late. Takoda's body was cold, and numerous injuries and signs of long-standing trauma clearly indicated the boy's prolonged suffering. Medics and police officers who arrived on the call later admitted they were shocked by what they saw. The child's medical condition was extremely serious, and his room was in a depressing state, filthy, without furniture, and with almost no personal belongings. Initially, McLean tried to argue that his son's death was an accident, claiming that the boy had fallen in the bathtub. However, the investigation quickly determined that this version did not match reality. An autopsy revealed numerous signs of lasting damage that could not have been the result of a single fall. Doctors concluded that death was due to severe injuries and suffocation. The investigation and interviews with neighbors revealed that the family had been under the supervision of social services, and concerns had been raised for several years. However, the measures taken were not enough to prevent the tragedy. Based on the evidence gathered, police arrested McLean on serious felony charges. The tragedy, which occurred in December 2019, caused a strong public outcry. Local residents expressed bewilderment as to why numerous alarms did not lead to more decisive action. The case was a major test for social services and law enforcement, who now find themselves under intense public scrutiny. The tragic events surrounding the life and fate of Takoda Collins have signaled the need for better child protection mechanisms to prevent similar cases from recurring in the future. After the body of 10-year-old Takoda Collins was discovered on December 13, 2019, Montgomery County investigators immediately began a thorough investigation. Initially, Al-Mutahan McLean claimed that what happened was an accident. However, during the investigation, police uncovered evidence that showed a different picture. Witness statements and data collected pointed to more complex and serious circumstances. The case became a priority for the local authorities, as the child's death and possible difficulties in the conditions of his upbringing caused a strong public outcry. The case drew attention to child protection issues and the importance of promptly responding to red flags in such situations. An initial inspection of the scene revealed many disturbing signs of dysfunctional living conditions. The room in which Takoda was housed lacked basic amenities. Instead of a full bed, there was an old mattress on the floor. There were few personal belongings in the room, and there was a general lack of sanitation. This evidence showed that the boy was living in conditions that did not meet the standards of care and welfare of a child, which already violated the requirements of the Child Protection Act. The pathologist who performed the autopsy confirmed investigators' fears. Takoda's death was the result of prolonged suffering and physical abuse. The injuries on the boy's body could not have been accidental, which became an important point for the further course of the investigation. Police began interviewing neighbors and acquaintances of the family. Many testified to the father's strange and sometimes violent behavior toward his son. One neighbor recalled, "We heard the boy screaming and crying, but we didn't know the right thing to do." This testimony added new details to the overall picture of what happened, helping investigators further understand the circumstances of Takoda's life. During the investigation, it was learned that social services had received repeated complaints about Takoda Collins' living conditions and his father's behavior. McLean had been under surveillance before, but had managed to avoid serious consequences by convincing social workers that he was in control of the situation. In some cases, he claimed to be using strict parenting techniques to deal with his son's difficult behavior. It also emerged that several complaints about Takoda's living conditions were not properly investigated, prompting criticism of social services. At least 2 cases of suspicion were not followed through despite existing indications of problems. One former social worker later admitted, "We suspected something was going wrong, but we didn't have enough evidence to take serious action." This admission further emphasized the need to overhaul the child protection system to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Police acted quickly after the initial investigation was completed. On December 15, 2019, Al-Mutahan McLean was arrested and charged with serious offenses, including harming and endangering a child. McLean was immediately taken into custody and was not granted bail. During questioning, McLean insisted on his innocence, claiming that what happened was an accident. He stated that his son allegedly slipped in the bathroom that day and hit his head. However, investigators, given the circumstances and the injuries found, did not accept these explanations. The investigation also revealed that there were regular acts of pressure in the family. A key witness testified that McLean often used excessive discipline on his son, forcing him to perform grueling tasks. This testimony helped investigators better understand what was going on in the home and confirmed the seriousness of the allegations. One of the keys to the investigation was the testimony of neighbors, which helped reveal the extent of what was going on. Many of them knew or suspected that there were serious problems in the family, but were either hesitant to contact the police or their concerns were not adequately addressed. This testimony was instrumental in strengthening the charges against McLean. Additional evidence came from the pathologist's report, which found Takoda had multiple injuries, indicating prolonged physical abuse. This evidence clearly showed that such actions were deliberate and systematic. McLean's arrest was an important milestone in the case, but only the beginning of a lengthy trial in which the prosecution was supported by compelling evidence. Witness testimony and medical reports made his defense in court much more difficult, making his situation extremely difficult. Following Al-Mutahan McLean's arrest in December 2019, preparations began for the trial, which immediately garnered a great deal of attention in Montgomery County. The public took an interest in the case, not only because of its shocking circumstances surrounding the difficult living conditions of Takoda Collins, but also because of questions about the performance of social services that failed to intervene in time to prevent the tragedy. The trial promised to be an important event for the city, as it raised the topic of better child protection mechanisms and opportunities to better respond to potential threats in the future. Al-Mutahan McLean is on trial on several serious charges. Prosecutors presented key points. The main charge is willful injury, resulting in the death of Takoda Collins. Prosecutors argued that McLean knowingly used physical force, causing the tragedy. The deprivation of liberty charge was that McLean restricted his son's freedom by controlling his every action and keeping him isolated. This created conditions in which the child could not lead a normal life. McLean was also charged with endangering the child's life because he subjected his son to regular physical and emotional challenges, and the living conditions were far from safe. The prosecution, led by District Attorney John Hemmons, argued that this was not an isolated incident, but a prolonged and willful violation of the child's rights that ultimately led to tragic consequences. The prosecutor emphasized that all the facts pointed to indifference to the son's well-being. The defense of Al-Mutahan McLean was led by attorney Robert Trent, who from the beginning tried to build the defense line on the fact that what happened was a tragic accident and not intentional actions. In court, the defense insisted that McLean used strict parenting techniques but had no intention of seriously harming his son. The defense's main argument was that Takoda had behavioral and emotional difficulties, and McLean, as a single parent, was trying to deal with this through disciplinary measures. The defense attorney argued that the events of that day were an accident resulting from a fall in the bathtub. However, this version was questioned on the basis of evidence, including witness testimony and medical evidence that pointed to the boy's systematic difficulties over a long period of time. One of the key points in the case against Al-Mutahan McLean was the testimony of witnesses, including neighbors and social workers, who described the difficult conditions in which Takoda lived and his father's behavior. One neighbor, who preferred to remain anonymous, stated in court, "I often heard the boy's cries and his pleas for help. However, at some point we all stopped paying attention, believing it was just family conflicts." This evidence strengthened the prosecution's case, indicating that the problems were known to those around them and were systematic. Photographs were also presented from Takoda's residence, which demonstrated the extremely unfavorable conditions in which the child was living. The room where he was forced to spend time was far from normal standards of living and resembled an isolation room more than a child's bedroom. Investigators confirmed that these circumstances had a significant impact on the boy's health and well-being, an important element in the prosecution's case. Equally significant was the testimony of the doctors and pathologist. The doctor who performed the autopsy noted that the nature of the injuries on the child's body indicated prolonged physical impact. He stated, "These injuries could not have been sustained in a short period of time. They are the result of prolonged and regular exposure." This evidence played a key role in proving that McLean's actions were premeditated and systematic. Once the key evidence was presented to the court, Al-Mutahan McLean's defense position weakened considerably. The defense attorneys realized that the chances of acquittal were minimal. Given the evidence presented and the possible penalty of life in prison, McLean decided to plead guilty to multiple charges. On Wednesday, December 16, 2020, McLean formally pleaded guilty to charges related to harming and endangering the life of a child. This plea evoked strong emotions from those in the courtroom, especially among the family and friends of Takoda Collins. The guilty plea allowed McLean to avoid a jury trial and possibly a harsher sentence that could have been imposed based on all the evidence. However, prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, demanding life in prison without parole. The public reaction to Al-Mutahan McLean's guilty plea was expectedly negative. Many Montgomery County residents wondered how this tragedy could have happened despite the obvious warning signs. Why didn't anyone stop this sooner? This question was frequently heard among citizens and in the local media. The death of Takoda Collins came to symbolize the flaws in a system that is supposed to protect the most vulnerable, children in difficult circumstances at home. Local news outlets vigorously debated the need to reform the child protection system. Community organizations called for a review of social services protocols and stronger measures to ensure the safety of disadvantaged children to prevent similar incidents in the future. December 16, 2020 was an important moment in the trial of Al-Mutahan McLean. His guilty plea changed not only the course of the case, but also had an impact on everyone involved in the trial. After realizing the seriousness of the evidence against him, McLean agreed to a plea bargain with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to the main counts of injury, retention, and child endangerment. This plea avoided a lengthy trial, but questions about the justice and consequences of the case continued to plague the public. Al-Mutahan McLean's decision to plead guilty came as no surprise to those involved in the trial. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented compelling evidence of his actions and detailed how it led to the tragic consequences for Takoda Collins. Prosecutors noted the importance of this admission in expediting the conclusion of the case, emphasizing that it did not detract from the seriousness of the violations committed. Prosecutor John Hemmons, commenting on the guilty plea, said, "We have achieved justice for Takoda. A guilty plea from a father who has long pressured his son means he will receive the punishment he deserves. It's a step toward making sure cases like this don't happen again." Hemmons also highlighted gaps in the social care system identified during the investigation and trial that need to be addressed in the future. The judge, hearing the case, noted that McLean's decision to plead guilty helped avoid further heartache for the Takoda family that would have resulted from a lengthy trial with witness interviews and detailed discussions of the complexities of the case. Immediately after the guilty plea, the sentencing hearings began. Given the seriousness of the charges, the prosecutor's office insisted on the maximum penalty, life imprisonment without parole. Prosecutors argued that McLean posed a threat not only to his son, but also to society, and his isolation was a necessary measure to protect others. In his final speech before sentencing, McLean said little. "I don't condone my actions. I just wanted to educate my son, but things got out of hand. I'm sorry." The statement, however, did not affect the overall sentiment in court. Relatives and loved ones of the Collins family expressed their outrage and demanded the harshest punishment for McLean. On January 17, 2021, the judge handed down the sentence. Al-Mutahan McLean was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge said the level of cruelty against the boy was monstrous and added, "We cannot change what happened, but we have a duty to do all we can to prevent similar tragedies in the future." The sentencing of Al-Mutahan McLean elicited mixed feelings, relief, but also pain and anger from the family of Takoda Collins. Relatives who attended the court hearing did not hide their emotions. Takoda's mother, who avoided public attention throughout the trial, later gave a brief comment to local news. "No punishment will bring my son back, but I hope his death will bring about a change in society so that no more children will suffer the way Takoda suffered." Local and national media covered the verdict extensively, emphasizing that the case was emblematic of the problems in the child protection system. In a number of articles, journalists criticized social services that failed to intervene in time despite troubling signs. The articles included testimonies from neighbors and documents indicating that warning signs often went unnoticed or ignored. The Al-Mutahan McLean case was an important lesson for law enforcement. Prosecutors, judges, and police officers recognize that cases of violence against children require greater attention and speed. Additional training was provided to police officers and investigators on recognizing the signs of domestic violence so that such cases could be identified and investigated earlier. Prosecutor Hemmons noted, "We must be more vigilant." This case showed that sometimes violence can go on for a long time and go undetected. It is our responsibility to prevent similar situations in the future. The case of Al-Mutahan McLean exemplified the tragic consequences of domestic violence and the shortcomings of the child protection system. The guilty plea that followed months of investigation led to a just sentence, but questions about how to prevent similar cases in the future remain. The community that watched the trial came to grips with a harsh reality. Despite alerts from neighbors and social services, Takoda Collins could not be saved.